All right. What would you call that? A squirrel? Chunky squirrel? Big boy? Large boy? What's another term you could use for this thing? Not an adjective. Not a tree squirrel. It's a mammal. John says it's a mammal, correct? Any other terms? Any other groups it belongs to? Rodent. It's a rodent. It's a mammal. It's a squirrel. Anything else? What? Diurnal. Okay, it is diurnal. What is a bigger group than even mammal? It's an animal. Okay. So you're giving me sort of categories that this thing belongs in. You started with specific. Could you be more specific than squirrel? Anybody know what type of squirrel? Yeah, it's an eastern gray squirrel. Good. So that's the most specific, because saying that this is an eastern gray squirrel is telling me it's what? That is the name of this species. And then when you were telling me that it's a rodent, that's a little bit of a larger category, a type of mammal. And mammals, a larger category. And then animals, even larger. So what you're telling me when you gave me those words are different taxonomic classifications of this organism. Okay. How about that? Okay. Is that very general? Is this a plant? Yes. Can you tell me something more specific? Okay, it's a tree. It's a woody plant, we would call that. That's another slightly smaller group, right? It's different than those spider plants growing in the back on the windowsill, right? That's an herbaceous plant. How about more specific? Can you tell me the family of that tree? If I asked you to name types of trees, you would probably come up with this. It's not a pine, but it's a maple. It's in the Aceraceae family. That's the maples. Anyone know what specific type of maple? It's a sugar maple, Acer saccharum. Yeah, that's a sugar maple tree. That's its species. Okay, it has a scientific name. Acer saccharum. Acer is its genus. Saccharum is its binomial Latin species name. And we see these around here. So good. So what we're looking at when we talk about those things, those are classifications. We're using taxonomy. We're talking about where do these organisms fit in to our understanding of living organisms and that we see all the time. All right. So this idea of grouping things and giving them names is something that we sort of just do naturally, as it's how we make sense of the world, right? We put things in categories. If I say tree, you know what I'm talking about. There, you have a general idea of, well, these things that look like this with these characteristics, there's trees. If I say mammal, you have an idea about what that is. As humans, we sort of categorize things. We put things into these groups to help us make sense of the world. And humans have been doing this forever. So the science of this is called taxonomy. Okay, it's putting names and classifying and grouping organisms together, and that's what this section of our notes is about. It's about taxonomy. How do we classify? How do we group the living things we see around us? We're going to learn about the groups and how we do that. If we think about the history of humans classifying these all the way back to ancient Greece, or even probably beyond that, people were putting life into groups. Aristotle, for example, 400 BC, grouped all living things into three categories: things that lived on land, things that lived in the air, things that lived in water. That's sort of one way to make sense of things. And that system held up for a long time. That's what people used to think about living things, about sort of where they lived. That's Aristotle. John Ray is another scientist in the mid-1600s. He based his classification system more on the body structures. Rather than where things live, he started categorizing things according to sort of the parts they had, the characteristics, the body structures. He also came up with the concept of species that really we kind of still use today. We consider a species a group of individuals that can mate together and produce fertile offspring. Our modern system that we use today was really developed by Carl von Linné in the 1700s. He actually changed his name to Latin version of it, Carolus Linnaeus. Really love Latin, this guy. And he came up with sort of a modern system. He's sometimes called the father of taxonomy. He came up with the idea of binomial nomenclature, which is this, and this is the book he wrote. It was pretty popular at the time. It's called System Naturae, where he sort of laid out his system of taxonomy. He came up with this idea of binomial nomenclature, and that just means that all species have a name that's been given to them by scientists. It's unique to that species. And it has two parts. It's like a first name and a last name. The first part of the binomial name is the genus of that species. Like I talked about the maple tree, Acer. All maples are in the genus Acer. And then species is more specific. Saccharum tells us it's a sugar maple. So we put those two words together, and that gives us the scientific name. And all organisms have a scientific name in Latin that's been designated to them. And scientists around the world, regardless of what language you speak as your native language, all scientists researching trees know that Acer saccharum is a sugar maple, even if in your own language you may call it something different. And so it allows scientists that speak different languages to use common terms for these species. So in modern taxonomy, you guys learned a little bit about this when we did that activity on Friday. The biggest, broadest group is called domain. For example, humans are in the same domain as a mushroom and a tree and a worm. It's a very broad category. It's not very specific. And as we go from the most general down to the more specific, we have these levels of classification. Kingdom, you're probably familiar with, right? There's 6 kingdoms. Phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If you think about where humans are in this classification system, our domain that we belong is Eukarya. We're animals. We are a type of animal called chordate. That's our phylum. It's animals with a spinal cord. It's basically vertebrates. Within vertebrates, we are in the group of mammals. We are in the class mammals. Organisms that have fur that nurse their young. Within mammals, we're primates, okay, with lemurs and apes and monkeys. That's the order we belong to. As we go down from family, genus, and species, our family is Hominidae. We're the only members of that family that are alive today. If you remember when we did the human evolution activity, you were looking at fossils of hominids. These were other members of this family that did exist at points in the past. The genus name that we belong in is Homo, and there were some other examples. There was Homo erectus, Homo habilis, other human ancestors that were in that same genus, and then our species name is sapiens, giving humans the scientific name Homo sapiens. Genus and species. So that's where humans are in that system. And so as we think about sort of modern taxonomy, like we said, Linnaeus, when he was setting up his system, he only had 2 kingdoms, plants and animals. Came up with the idea of binomial nomenclature. Everything has a two-part name, genus and species. It's written in italics usually, or underlined if you're writing it by hand. It is, the first letter is capitalized of genus, and the species part is not capitalized at all. There's a couple other examples of scientific names. Felis leo, it's a lion. Felis domesticus, that's just a cat, a house cat. Are they closely related? It's a house cat and a lion closely related based on their names? Yeah, they're in the same genus. Right? They're different species, but they're in the same genus. So that means they are pretty closely related. As scientists learn more about sort of smaller organisms, as microscopes started to be developed, they started to understand, well, there's other types of living things that we haven't really seen. Things like protists, microscopic organisms that people found in water. So protists were added, things that are not really an animal, not really a plant. Then bacteria were added as their own group, okay, in the 1950s. And then fungi were separated out, okay, from other groups and so forth. So where we ended up today is with 6 kingdoms altogether. And now we have other information. As we think about what were these other scientists using to classify, they're just looking at the organisms typically, okay? Looking at their outward characteristics. Nowadays, we know about DNA. We could compare the DNA of different species. We can see how they're related. And that's added a lot to what we know about how species are related to each other. We often, the science of sort of understanding the relationship between different organisms is called cladistics. Okay? It uses molecular evidence, DNA, protein evidence that we have now to create these diagrams which show us how species are related. And we've seen these already. When we were talking about evolution in that unit, we were looking at these diagrams. We were looking at which species have common ancestors, which species are most closely related. Here we see an example of that. Here's that hagfish. That's in March Mammal Madness. And so so as evolution took place, as a jaw developed, a hagfish is a fish without a jaw. It's got a weird, like, sucker-like mouth. Then jaws evolved. Everything that comes after this has a jaw, like the perch. And then lungs evolved over time. And everything after this point had lungs. And then claws and nails and feather and fur and mammary glands. So you can put together a diagram that shows us the relationships between different organisms. Here's an example. These are mammals. This is a diagram that shows how various types of mammals are related to each other. Tell me what's a squirrel most closely related to, based on this diagram? Right, guinea pig. What would we call all of these things? Somebody used the word already. They're all rodents, right? Here we see chimps, bonobos, humans, gorillas, orangutans. These are the primates in this group. So we can put together these diagrams to help us understand the relationship between different species. So how do we classify things into their domains and kingdoms? Well, we look at 4 basic characteristics. How many cells they're made of, whether or not they have a nuclear membrane, how they get energy, and whether or not they have a cell wall. So we'll talk about what these things mean. So number of cells. Some organisms are just a single cell. That's all they are. Other organisms are made of many cells working together. That's one difference. Unicellular is the term for a single-celled organism. Multicellular is the term for an organism made of many cells working together. Obviously, we are multicellular. We're made of many, many trillions of cells, all coordinating their activity to make us. Whereas an amoeba or a bacteria is just one single cell. Some groups of organisms that are very simple, they don't have a nucleus. We'll talk about cells in a next week. But the nucleus is a part within a cell made of a membrane surrounding the DNA. Some organisms don't have that, like bacteria, for example. Their DNA is just floating all throughout the cell. It's not contained within a membrane. That's called a prokaryote. If it helps you to remember, pro rhymes with no, because prokaryotes have no nuclear membrane. They also have no other membrane-bound organelles. You are a eukaryote. Eukaryotes do have a nuclear membrane. The DNA is held in chromosomes within these nuclear membranes. Nutrition, how an organism gets energy. Some organisms are autotroph. What does that mean? Make their own food, produce their own food through photosynthesis. Other organisms are heterotrophs. What does that mean? How do they get energy if they can't make their own energy? Jordan? Yeah, they eat stuff. Heterotrophs have to eat stuff. And finally, cell wall. Some organisms have a cell wall, some don't. And cell walls can be made of different types of material. So that's used to put things in different groups. So those are the main characteristics we look at to put things in the broad categories of domain and kingdom. So we'll talk about a few of those. Domain bacteria. So what about bacteria? How many cells are they made of? One. What's the term for it? They're unicellular. Bacteria are very simple cells. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have a nuclear membrane. They still have DNA, but it's not held within a membrane. The term for that, if they have no nuclear membrane, and prokaryote, good. No nuclear membrane. How about bacteria? How do they get energy? Do they make their own food or do they have to consume other things? Do they do both? They can do both. Some bacteria can go through photosynthesis. Some bacteria cannot. So there are some bacteria in each category, autotrophs and heterotrophs. They do have a cell wall, and it's made of this substance called peptidoglycan. And they can reproduce asexually or sexually. We're going to talk about that yet. That's a review from 7th grade. Asexually reproducing organisms basically just copy themselves. One parent splits in two, copies its DNA, splits in two, and then you have two organisms. It's reproduced. Sexually reproducing organisms, two parents have to mix genetic material to produce the offspring. And actually, bacteria can do either one. They can just sort of split in two and make copies, or bacteria can go through this process called conjugation, which they exchange parts of DNA with two bacteria to produce offspring. Some examples of bacteria. You may have had this one growing in your throat before. Streptococcus bacteria. It causes strep throat. Staphylococcus, another pathogenic bacteria that causes skin infections. E. coli. This is a bacteria that lives in our digestive system. Helps us digest certain types of foods, but also can cause food poisoning, different versions of it. Blue-green algae. That's an autotrophic type of bacteria. Here's Streptococcus. Staphylococcus. E. coli. Blue-green algae. So there's three domains, like we said. One is bacteria. The second is Archaea, which you're probably very unfamiliar with, because Archaea were actually kind of discovered pretty recently, and they were discovered in locations where scientists thought nothing would be able to survive. In hot springs, living in hot springs, in extreme salt conditions, in very acidic conditions. Scientists thought nothing could survive these conditions, but when they actually looked closer, they found these organisms that were different from anything else scientists had found, and they're called Archaea. When we go through the characteristics, they sound very similar to bacteria. They're unicellular. They're prokaryotes. There's some heterotrophs and some autotrophs. Where they become different is they do have a cell wall, but they have a sort of unique cell wall that's made of different stuff than bacteria. They can reproduce asexually through just splitting in two. So these first Archaea that were discovered were called extremophiles because they could survive these extreme conditions. They can live in deep sea vents where there's this compound, sulfur and methogen that are released, which scientists thought would be toxic to life. Halophiles live in extreme salt conditions. Thermophiles live in extreme temperatures. And since then, although these organisms are first discovered in extreme conditions, once scientists realized that they were around, They actually found them all over the place. They're in the soil. Scientists didn't know to look for them before they were discovered, and so they're all around these archaea. Even though we probably don't have a lot of experience hearing about them. And then the third domain. So the three domains: bacteria, archaea, and then the last one is Eukarya. This is the one we're familiar with. Right? This includes fungi and plants and animals and protists. And it's called Eukarya because it's made of all eukaryotes, all organisms that have a nuclear membrane. There's 4 kingdoms in it: protists, fungi, plants, and animals. We'll talk about the kingdoms separately. Kingdom Protista, protists. You may have looked at them in 7th grade under the microscope. Amoeba, paramecium, euglena. These are mostly single-celled organisms. Like all members of Eukarya, they do have a nucleus. They're eukaryotes. Some of them are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs. They're kind of mixed in terms of how they obtain energy. Most of them don't have a cell wall, but there are some that do, some algae. They can reproduce sexually or asexually. And protists are a kingdom where scientists just sort of were throwing random things that didn't kind of fit in any of the other kingdoms. That's where it started from. Since scientists have now DNA evidence, what they find is, well, some of these things we put in protists that they're not really that closely related to each other, but it's still sort of used. There's different types of protists. We won't get into the details. And so the ones you probably are familiar with are these. These are protists that are kind of animal-like protists. They move around. They're found often in fresh water. This is an amoeba. It just kind of blobs around, oozing forward. It's like a blob that just kind of extends the cytoplasm forward. That's how it moves. That's how it ingests food. Uses these extensions that ooze forward are called pseudopods. Other protists have little tiny hairs around them called cilia, and those little hairs kind of paddle it through the water like oars on a boat. That's this paramecium. Other protists have a flagellum, a tail that sort of spins in this corkscrew pattern, propelling it through the water. So these are protists that can move from place to place. Oops, sorry. And scientists didn't really discover these until microscopes were invented. But once they started to look in like pond water, what they would find is lots of these small single-celled organisms living, moving around, consuming food, etc. And so they sort of put them in this category of protist. Algae are also members of the protists. These are plant-like protists. They really don't move around. They have a cell wall. They're autotrophs. Okay, here's some examples: kelp and diatoms. This one with this shape is called spirogyra. It has this spiral shape. Kelp actually grows together in groups of cells. It looks like a plant growing in the water, but it's actually considered a protist. These are the shells of diatoms. They make this exoskeleton. They have these really interesting and unique shapes. They're kind of interesting. Look, this is called volvox. Forms these spheres. Fungi. It's another kingdom of Eukarya. What's an example of fungi? Besides myself. I'm a fungi, yeah. You can't be a science teacher and not make that joke in class when you mention the word fungi. It's part of the rules. Fungi are multicellular usually, but there's some unicellular fungi as well. They do have a nucleus. What are they? Are they plants? Why isn't a mushroom a plant? Yeah, because they don't go through photosynthesis. They're not autotrophs. Well, what does a mushroom eat then? Dead organic matter in the soil. Like if you see mushrooms growing out of the ground, they're decomposing something underneath the soil, in the soil. In my front yard, like we have a sidewalk, and then we have like the area where trees were, and we had a tree that got cut down, and they ground the stump. But now every spring, right exactly where that tree is, a huge patch of mushrooms grows in the spring. And they grow there because in the soil, there's still all the roots of that tree. There's organic matter. And so those mushrooms grow up and they're slowly decomposing. That's what they're using as energy. They're using that wood that's in the ground. That's what they consume. So mushrooms are decomposers. What they do is they excrete enzymes that break down organic matter, and then they absorb the nutrients afterwards. They have a cell wall around their cells. It contains a substance called chitin. And they reproduce using spores. I never find puffballs in the woods or growing around your house. Puffball mushrooms. You squeeze them and like it looks like smoke comes out of them. Yeah, those are mushrooms. Those are fungi. And what's that smoke that comes out? They're spores. When you squeeze them and a little puff of stuff comes out, those are their spores, and you're actually helping them to spread and reproduce. They're edible when they're young. Puffball, when it's young, it's like light in color. If you were to cut it, it's solid, but as it matures, it becomes hollow. The spores develop. So if you find them when they're young, they actually are edible. They taste like a white mushroom you find at the store, like that you buy. Examples of fungi: mushrooms, mold, mildew, yeast also. It's all right. I cleaned my bathroom after I took this picture. Sorry. What do you mean? I don't know. Yeah, and I mean, mold is and mildew is not really good for your respiratory system. Like black mold, the spores and the particles it produces are bad for your lungs. So if you have mold in your house, you should remediate it. All right, 2 more kingdoms left, plants and animals. You know, it's a lot of notes today. The actual Latin name for the plant kingdom is Plantae. Multicellular or unicellular? Plants. Plants. Multicellular or unicellular? Which one? Multi. Do they have a nucleus? Yes, everything in the domain Eukarya has a nucleus. How do they get energy? Autotrophs. They have chloroplasts. They can use sunlight and carbon dioxide to produce their own energy. They have a cell wall around their cell membrane made of cellulose. Do plants reproduce sexually or asexually? Both. Not the sun. No. Yeah, pollen is actually the male reproductive cell. Pollen is actually the sperm of plants. And what are flowers? Flowers are the reproductive organs of plants. So if you buy somebody, present them with a beautiful bouquet of flowers, you're really giving them the plant's reproductive organs. It's kind of weird to think about. If you're allergic to pollen, you're allergic to plant sperm. So pollen grains are male reproductive cells floating through the air or carried on animals. And when pollen grains from one plant end up in the female reproductive structures of another plant, fertilization happens and they reproduce sexually. What about when you're eating a piece of fruit? What are you actually eating? The ripened ovary of a female plant. That's what fruits are. After fertilization, and what if you eat sunflower seeds? What are you actually eating? The embryos of those plants. A seed is basically an embryo, contains within it an embryo of a plant. So, yeah. All right. So plants have 2 big groups, bryophytes and tracheophytes. You're probably not familiar with bryophytes. Do you have the slide in your notes? Bryophytes are things like mosses. And they're different from other plants because they don't have vascular tissue to carry water and nutrients around. So they only grow pretty low to the ground because they can't move things around very easily. So that's why mosses sort of grow in like carpety kind of mats. Most of the plants we're familiar with are called tracheophytes. They do have these vessels that can carry water and nutrients around from one place to another. They can grow really tall because of this. They have stems and roots and leaves, a xylem and phloem for transporting things. Plants actually have 2 types of basically like tubes that transport things around. The xylem carries water from the roots where the water is absorbed up through the rest of the plant. And then the phloem takes the sugars that are being produced in the leaves and moves them around the plant. Right about now, some people are tapping into the phloem of trees. For what purpose? To produce maple syrup. So when people tap a maple tree, as in the springtime, sugars that the plant stored in the roots as they're going back up to start to provide energy for the rest of the plant, you can extract some of that fluid and then boil it, remove most of the water, and you're left with the sugars that the plant's made. That's what maple syrup is. Types of plants like ferns, herbaceous plants like this Queen Anne's lace, and then sugar maple tree would be an example of another. All right, let's finish with a slide. Our final kingdom. Kingdom Animalia, the animals. Single cell or multicell? Multicellular. Do they have a nucleus? So what's the term for them? Eukaryote. They do have a nucleus. You do. Autotroph or heterotroph? Hetero. They have to eat other things, right? They have to consume. You have to consume other organisms to get energy. You may eat other dead animals or fungi or plants, but you have to eat some other organism in order to get energy. They do not have a cell wall in their cells, and they reproduce mostly sexually. Most move around, but not all. Some are sessile, which means basically stuck in one place. Things like coral, sponges, barnacles. And next time we take notes, we'll talk about the different types of animals.